tablature provides an easy way to read and write music for a specific instrument, in this case the ukulele. You'll find that it has similarities to regular sheet music or standard notation, but there's a lot of differences that make tablature easier to understand. Now, the tablature staff looks similar to standard notation, but instead of each line representing a note, in tablature, or tab for short, each line represents a string on the ukulele. Now here you can see one measure of tab. Usually in the first measure, I'll include the tuning, which in this case is standard tuning, G, C, E, and A. You'll notice that the fourth string is the one on top as you're playing the uke, and the first string is the one nearest to the floor. Now in the tab you can see that the top line represents the first string. The second line represents the second string. The third line represents the third string. And of course the fourth line represents the fourth string. Now, usually in the first measure I also include the time signature. In this case it's 4/4 time. That means there's going to be 4 beats in each measure. A 0 is used to represent a string that's played open. And by open, that means that you don't need to hold any frets down with your left hand. Now in this example, there's only one note. Since it's on the first line, you play the first string. Because it's a 0, you play it open, like this. Now I've added the count above the measure so you remember to hold this note out for 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. And a note that's held for 4 beats is called a whole note. Notice that a whole note does not have a stem underneath it. Now in this measure we have 2 half notes. A half note gets 2 beats. And here's how this measure sounds. 1, 2, 3, 4. The half notes are designated by a short stem below the line of tablature. I'm still including the count above the measure for demonstration purposes, but that's not present normally, so be sure you know the value of the notes from the stems. And for a quarter note, there's a long stem that descends all the way down from the bottom of the note to below the line of tablature. This measure consists of 4 quarter notes, and it sounds like this. 2, 3, 4. Notes can be broken down further, and the smaller the fraction, the faster, relatively speaking, the notes are. Now here we have a measure broken down into 8 eighth notes. An eighth note receives a half beat. It's usually, but not always, connected by the stem to another eighth note. You play 2 eighth notes in the same amount of time that it takes you to play 1 quarter note. Now playing this measure and counting it out loud, it sounds like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. It's important to remember that in a standard measure of 4/4 time, all the notes in a measure add up to one whole note. So you might have a whole note in a measure, or some combination of half notes, quarter notes, and eighth notes, maybe even 16th notes. In this example, we have 2 quarter notes and 4 eighth notes. It sounds like this. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and. And just as in standard notation, if a dot follows a note, the time value of that note is increased by 50%. For example, a dotted half note would receive 3 beats instead of 2 beats. In the example here, we have a dotted quarter note, so that would have a time value of a quarter note plus an eighth note, or 3 eighth notes. The measure sounds like this. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and. You'll also see in this measure an eighth note that's not connected to another eighth note. The dotted quarter note at the count of 1 has a time value of a quarter note plus an eighth note. So instead of that next eighth note coming in at the count of 2, it comes in on the and after the count of 2. The connected stems for the eighth notes are done in pairs. For instance, 1 and is a pair, 2 and would be a pair, 3 and a pair, 4 and is a pair. So in this case, since the count of 2 is part of that first dotted quarter note, the eighth note that comes in on the and after the count of 2 is not part of a pair. So instead, you'll see a little flag on the bottom of the stem. That means it's an eighth note and receives a half beat, like all the other eighth notes. But it's not part of a pair of eighth notes, so it looks a little different in the tab. Let's go over a simple melody, the first 4 measures of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. We'll do it slowly, 1 measure at a time. I'm going to explain it as I go. You'll notice that in this first measure, all the notes are quarter notes, so each one receives 1 beat. You see a 1 on the second line. That means you'll hold down the first fret, second string, and play it. Then that same note repeats on the count of 2. The next note you see is a 3 on the first line, so hold down the third fret, first string, and play that. And you repeat that same note on the count of 4. So that whole measure sounds like this. Okay, now let's go to the second measure where the first note is a 5 on the first line, so you move your hand up, hold the 5th fret of the first string, and play that. And then the second note in the measure is a repeat of the first notes, first string, 5th fret. And then at the count of 3, you go back down and play the first string, 3rd fret. Notice that that one's a half note, so you hold it for 2 beats. You see that the stems for the first 2 quarter notes go all the way from the note to underneath the tablature. There's only a short stem underneath the tablature for the half note. So that whole measure sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the next measure is all quarter notes again. First string, 1st fret, and then first string, 1st fret again, and first string open, and first string open again. Then the last measure is 2nd string, 3rd fret, then 2nd string, 3rd fret again, and finally then the 2nd string, 1st fret, which you hold for 2 beats. Okay, then playing all 4 measures slowly without any interruptions, it'll sound like this. If you see notes that are stacked like this, it means to strum. You see that each of the 4 beats in this measure has 4 notes. You have the first string, 3rd fret, the second string open, the third string open, and the 4th string open, which you most likely recognize as a C chord. So you just strum a C chord on each beat in this measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Just like that. And our next example combines single notes and strums. So it begins at the count of 1 with the 3rd string open, then strum a C chord on the count of 2, then 3rd string open again on the count of 3, and on the count of 4 strum a C chord again. So the whole measure is 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're playing clawhammer style, here's what the tab looks like for a measure of the basic bum ditty while you're holding the C chord. The count of 1 is the bum, which is a quarter note. We're playing the 3rd string. At the count of 2 is the ditty. It's actually 2 eighth notes. Ditty. And then you just repeat the same thing on the counts of 3 and 4. So that whole measure is okay, now still holding a C chord, for the drop thumb, the counts of 1 and 2 are the same as in the standard bum ditty. Then for the counts of 3 and 4, we have 4 eighth notes. First string played with your middle finger, then thumb on the second string, first string on middle finger again, and finally your thumb goes back up and plays the 4th string. So that entire measure sounds like this. Most of the time I'll include the right hand fingering below the tablature as it is here. The M stands for your middle finger, T stands for your thumb, And for finger style, you're going to also see I, which stands for your index finger. Now, all my finger picking arrangements use 3 fingers: thumb, index, and middle. As I mentioned earlier, I'll usually include the fingering below the line of tablature, as you see. There are some exceptions, but usually I'll use the middle finger for the first string and the index finger for the second string. And then the thumb is going to play the third and fourth strings, and a lot of times it'll also go down and play the second string, just depending on how the notes work out in an arrangement. In the example on the screen, at the count of 1, I've included the chord name, the C, and that'll be included in any measure where there's a chord change in a song. So when you see the letter C, you know to hold a C chord. On the count of 1, you see that there are 2 notes that need to be played at the same time: the first string 3rd fret and the 4th string open. And this is commonly known as a pinch. And you'll play the first string with your middle finger. At the same time, you play the 4th string with your thumb. It sounds like this. That pinch at the count of 1 is a quarter note. As I said earlier, a quarter note has a long stem going from the note to below the line of tablature. Now in this case, since one of the notes is on the 4th string, there's really no room for the long stem. But you can still tell it's a quarter note. It's not connected to the rest of the notes in the measure. Notice that the counts of 2, 3, and 4 contain pairs of eighth notes. You know that 6 eighth notes plus a quarter note would equal a whole note. So let's play the rest of the measure. After the pinch on the count of 1, on the count of 2, you bring your thumb down, hit the 3rd string. That's followed by playing the 2nd string with your index finger. Then the thumb on the 4th string. Middle finger on the 1st string. And thumb on the 3rd string. Index finger on the 2nd string. So the whole measure sounds like this. I'll play it a few times in a row. Now here's what a hammer-on looks like in tablature. At the count of 3, play the 2nd string open. The H stands for hammer-on. You'll hammer down on the 1st fret. Those are both eighth notes, and get a half beat each. So the whole measure sounds like this. Now, in a measure like this, I ordinarily play the 2nd string with my thumb, both on the count of 1 and 3. You might choose to play it with your index finger, and that's okay. The reason I use my thumb is because most of the finger picking that I do includes alternating my thumb on every beat. So most of the time, at least, I'll be playing 4 notes in every measure with my thumb. It helps me to keep a good 4/4 rhythm going, and it's similar to Travis picking on the guitar. One more thing I should mention before showing you a couple other slurred note examples. If you need help understanding how to do these hammer-ons, pull-offs, and slides, watch my video on slurred notes, and it explains the mechanics of this in detail. Variation of that same measure, a previous measure, in claw hammer style looks like this. You'd play the 2nd string, then ditty, then 2nd string with a hammer-on, and ditty. Notice that after the hammer-on, I'm still holding down the 2nd string 1st fret. I'll play the ditty. And here's that measure played a few times. Okay, now here's an example of what a pull-off looks like in claw hammer tablature. PO stands for pull-off. There are 2 pull-offs in this measure. Slowly it sounds like this. Now hold the C chord and continue to hold the C chord when you're playing the notes written in the tab. Start out by holding the 2nd string 1st fret, play that, then pull off to open, and then ditty. Then 3rd string 2nd fret, pull off to open, and another ditty. And Here's that measure a few times. Okay, now at the count of 1 in this measure is an example of a slide. The letters SL between the 2 and the 4 on the 3rd line at the count of 1 means you should play the 3rd string, 2nd fret, and slide up to the 4th fret. Notice also that on the count of 2, while you're playing the ditty, you're holding the 3rd string, 4th fret. So and then on the count of 3, we've got to pull off 2nd string, 3rd string, 2nd fret up to open. So you need to come back down and play that. And then another ditty. Now in this particular measure, it's probably best when you're sliding up to use your middle finger to slide. And you go back down and play the pull off. Maybe best to use your index finger. So that's about it for how to read ukulele tablature.